Perhaps one of the most controversial issues throughout American and even world history is the debate over the rights of the interned and the responsibility of the government to protect and uphold them. There is no greater example of this debate as Japanese internment during the Second World War. The bombing of Pearl Harbor in early December of 1941 launched the United States into war against Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire. Executive Order 9066 was signed into action in February of 1942. This order gave Lieutenant General DeWitt the right to enforce a mass removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast, especially California, for fear of espionage. But underlying question of all of this was, what are the rights of citizens during wartime, and does the government have the right to limit them? This is a question that has perplexed philosophers and historians alike for centuries. Nearly 5 years before Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland, the Empire of Japan had great ambitions for expanding its horizon. A war between Japan and its neighbor China broke out in 1937, almost 5 years before the U.S. entered the Second World War. This war was known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. Much of China was conquered, and the United States' support of China during this war formed deep tension between the United States and Japan that would fail to dissipate. Not long after, Japan turned its gaze towards the American and European territories in the Pacific. By this time, World War II had begun, and Germany's success in Europe bolstered the Japanese effort to take the Pacific, starting with Dutch Indonesia. The aggression of Japan led the United States, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom to place several harsh embargoes on important resources, such as oil and steel, to Japan. These actions only served to drive Japan into a stronger alliance with the Axis powers. President Roosevelt then reinforced the Philippines and issued an ultimatum to Japan, known as the Hull Note, demanding the halt of further Japanese expansion and concede to all captured land. Japan, believing this to be an unspoken declaration of war, attacked the naval base at Hawaii in an attempt to quickly neutralize the American Navy in the Pacific. This attack was also known as the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and after that the war started. Quickly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan swept through Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Early Allied losses in the Pacific caused a mass hysteria back home. This wave of fear influenced the President. Roosevelt himself was concerned about the large population of Japanese Americans on the West Coast, and the threat that they may pose to the security of the country. His fear is not totally misplaced, as the Niihau incident occurred on the island of Niihau, which led to more anti-Japanese sentiment among the military and government. To combat these actions, FDR and Attorney General Francis Bidle began the strategic arrest of many Japanese Americans living in key defensive zones in the West, and created zones where they are not allowed to live. In early February of 1942, a large group of quote-unquote Japs were arrested on the California coast. This act was orchestrated by Governor Olson. Only 2 weeks later, FDR established Executive Order 9066. On February 19, 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, which demanded the mass removal of about 100,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast, mainly California, towards the central United States. This order applied to anyone with even the slightest Japanese ancestry. These evacuees were to be sent to temporary camps named civilian assembly camps. Most of these residents would eventually be moved to relocation centers, which became known as internment camps. This evacuation heavily targeted Japanese citizens in California, where there is a high percentage of Japanese Americans. However, despite the government's claim that this expulsion was necessary during times of war and crisis, very little effort was put into moving Japanese Americans living in Hawaii, which at the time had a 33% Japanese population, and little to no espionage took place there. The evacuees were informed that they were limited to bring what they could carry, requiring them to leave many personal belongings with friends, or in the government-provided storage with little to no guarantee of safety. Nearly all points in the journey, the evacuees' luggage was thoroughly searched, thereby removing the right to privacy. These camps that the Japanese Americans were being sent to were hastily constructed by soldiers, or quickly converted from horse stables or barracks into the most basic living area possible. The rooms in these camps were unfurnished and bare, save for one army cot per person. There is hardly any privacy in the camps. Very basic meals were provided to the residents of the camps, along with scant facilities of one laundry room and latrine per camp. Many camps were built in undesirable locations, like the camp situated in Topaz, Utah. This camp was constructed in a desert, where dust storms were common, which caused many health problems among the Japanese Americans. Living conditions in the camps were very poor and confined. Head counts were given routinely throughout the day as the residents of these camps lived a militaristic lifestyle run by the sound of the whistle and shouting men. Schooling in medicine was left up to the specialists of the Japanese American community to work out. The near imprisonment of 100,000 Japanese Americans, most of which were full American citizens, was a violation of many rights promised to all American citizens by the Constitution and its amendments. These evacuees were deprived of their right to trial by jury for crimes as well as search and seizure. Most of the Japanese interned at these camps had never done anything against the U.S. and never planned to, despite their home country's war on the U.S. Many Japanese Americans in these camps still willingly recited the Pledge of Allegiance. After the executive order was signed into effect, many Japanese American citizens attempted to avoid internment with plastic surgery and name changes. Fred Korematsu is one of these people, and he was caught and worked to get a case to the Supreme Court and have the executive order declared unconstitutional on the grounds that none of the prisoners were informed on how long they were staying, giving good reasoning as to why they were interned at all, or why they were not entitled to a trial by jury, as stated in the Constitution. As Korematsu v. United States proceeded up the chain of courts, many issues were debated upon, which were then divided up. The trial of Korematsu accumulated in almost nothing, as the Supreme Court upheld the executive order, and the situation for Japanese Americans remained unchanged for the duration of the war. Eventually, after a long debate and a personal letter from Korematsu to the president himself, Executive Order 9066 was deemed unconstitutional and removed from effect. The brutal internment of 100,000 Japanese American citizens led to a reduction in the power of the government shortly thereafter. This reduction was in regards to the new law that disallowed the government to discriminate or imprison anyone within the United States based solely on race or race preconceptions. The population of Japanese Americans has still not recovered to the levels they were at. Long after the war ended in 1988, President Ronald Reagan made a formal apology to the survivors of the internment and paid out $20,000 to each with the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. To put this into perspective, this was the only time the federal government had ever officially apologized for its actions against the people based on race. The apology was made for imprisoning many Japanese Americans for no conceivable reason other than they haven't tried to bomb us yet, so that means they must be planning on it. In the end, one of the most important responsibilities of any government is to protect the rights of all of its citizens. The executive order brushed aside the rights of more than 100,000 Japanese Americans, for it is ultimately the responsibility of those in power to uphold the rights beneath them, and in this instance, the American government failed to do just that.